Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator, and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to DEI After 5. In this episode, I will be talking to someone who has been just there for me over the last few years in this space. And, you know, as practitioners, you kind of meet up and connect with people in different times, different programs, activities, but there are a few that just kind of stick with you. And so this person has been one of those for me. And so today I want to welcome my friend, Frank Starling. How are you?
I'm doing really well, thanks, Sacha. Great to be here. How are you?
I'm doing well. So glad that you could join me today. So for those that have not met you or don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Sure, yeah, brief intro really. So I'm founder and CEO of a company called Variety Pack. So we're diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants, primarily based out of the UK. Really help scaling businesses on that journey of creating equity to building inclusive workspaces. So.
And how did you get into this work?
Yeah, so my journey started about 7 years ago. I started working with my local community to close the access gap for marginalized Black men. Actually, the community in which I live in, it had really the biggest access gap in the entire country, and that really frustrated me. So I offered to be a business mentor. I was providing networks. I was just generally just trying to see what I could do to amplify this group. And that really inspired me. I founded my company, Variety Pack, just over 3 years ago now. So done a lot of different kind of things in the space, did accreditation with Cornell University, with Wharton, with various other institutions out there. But more so than ever, I think I just want to see a level playing field, if I'm honest. So that drew me into the space, I think, primarily more than anything else.
Yeah, when I think back to some of our early conversations, that's basically what they were. It was, how do we do this? And working across the pond, right? Doing this US, UK. I think at the time I was doing a little bit more work in the UK and just trying to figure out, well, what are some of the differences? There are lots of similarities, but there are also some very nuanced differences. And I think that it's important, especially for organizations that are global, or at least have a more outside of the United States lens. I'll put it that way, to understand some of those nuances. And so can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you have seen in the UK that may or may not come top of mind for folks in the US or studying in other places, working in other places?
Yeah, I think there's lots of different kind of significant differences, first and foremost. So I think with UK and Europe businesses, that word of equality tends to pop up more often. And of course, it's problematic, right? If we use that word equality, if I was to go and buy everyone at the equity equation a pair of shoes, and it was exactly the same penny loafer, exactly the same color, and exactly the same size, that's a really good analogy for equality, right? Everyone gets access to the same thing. And I think there are many businesses in the UK and Europe which are principally kind of stuck on that bit of equality, really trying to move up to that equity piece. There's also this element of socioeconomic background, sometimes referred to as class. That's a significant factor here in businesses in the UK and in Europe. I would say in the US, obviously the dynamic of socioeconomic background is somewhat different, but it can often get forgotten about. So,
talk to me a little bit more about that, right? Because when I hear class, I think of kind of caste systems. I think of some of the other things that we may see in other parts of the world, where again, it's still in the US, but it's so much more prominent, I believe, in other parts of the world. And so can you talk a little bit about how that shows up in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, as you say, there's a level of subjectivity to that word class. And to be honest, I don't even like the word, right? Because for me, it says segregation. But at least what it helps us to delineate is some of us have had a slightly thornier path than others. Your socioeconomic background, your start in life, you may have had two parents growing up. You may have had a secure household where you didn't have to pay for your education. You may have had access to all of the resources you needed as you were kind of journeying through your life, that allowed you to make decisions which are maybe slightly riskier than others. And for others, you can paint a very different picture, where you grew up in a single parent household, maybe you grew up on a council estate. Maybe your family struggled with just getting their daily bread. I can definitely speak to that. That was certainly my background. So with that creates an access gap where those two different households, those two different families, sometimes the young people within those households are not necessarily going to get fair access to opportunities, and that can impact their entire life, their entire trajectory. So when we forget about talking about this thing of socioeconomic background or class, depending on where you are, it can sometimes negate the fact that there is an access gap. There can sometimes be that glass ceiling that is present based on your background, based on your start in life. And I think the biggest shift there is that there are businesses in the UK where it can still hang over you. You don't necessarily get the same opportunity unless you're in a company that will remove those ceilings and really wants to empower anyone and everyone, and really appreciates having that diversity at the table.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
So one of the things I've been really curious about lately are hot topics. Right. So there's certain hot topics that come up in diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are some of the hot topics that you and your company are dealing with right now?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of hot topics which are really standing out at the moment, looking at 2022 and what changes businesses can make. I think the first one is this word of allyship, which I think is often misunderstood. I think a lot of people use the word ally or allyship quite flippantly without really knowing and understanding what allyship truly is. For me, allyship is being aware of your biases, being aware of your power and privilege, and using your platform to support the underrepresented. That's allyship. It can sometimes be described in many different ways, but I think if businesses are really if they're going to jump onto a hot topic and they want to get it right and get some quick wins in the D&I space, then allyship, I think, for me, is a really significant thing that lots of companies should focus on. Another one which I think is spoken about, but it's not coupled with the right elements, is psychological safety. So we hear a lot about psychological safety, Amy Edmonton's research, which is obviously brilliant in its own right. At the same time, I think we have to couple psychological safety with intersectionality. What Kimberly Crenshaw talks about, that hierarchy that we're trying to dismantle, simply because psychological safety certainly can benefit those who may be in a privileged position. The ability to speak with candor, the ability to feel safe, secure, and supported in any situation. That can sometimes, that entire setup can tend to favor people who maybe, let's say, overrepresented, who aren't necessarily challenged with barriers. If we bring in intersectionality, then we recognize that the layer cake of your lived experiences, of course, is going to impact your psychological safety, right? Because it's going to impact how you necessarily feel included in part of that organization, and therefore your voice as well. So I think it's sometimes demystifying these buzzwords to action points. And for me, when we talk about hot topics, it's like, how do we bring it down to, like, what are the results we want to see? Even if we're calling it allyship or calling it psychological safety, what does it actually mean? And how do we bring that into like relevancy to each person's role? So I think that's a big thing that I think companies should really drill down on.
We did not talk about this at all. And so when you said psychological safety, I'm like, that's my thing. I absolutely
100
about that.
Yeah.
Because what I've started doing too with clients, so I'll come in and I'll do assessments around psychological safety. But before that, I have one-on-ones with whoever's the most marginalized on the team.
Yeah, right.
Because I want to make sure that I'm hearing what their experiences are, that their voices matter, right? Okay. And I know that what they're saying may get lost in the assessment. And so I want to make sure that all of that is kind of captured, but then I can identify, okay, there's some other challenges here that may go above and beyond psychological safety, or maybe hindering the safety for some folks, such as microaggressions, right?
Absolutely.
I'm hearing microaggressions. I'm hearing it. I'm hearing it happening. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I'm smiling because as soon as you say microaggressions, for me, we know as practitioners, that's where a lot of the real work lies. It's like tackling microaggressions and microbehaviors. And every year I scan through enterprise D&I strategies. And for some reason, I never see visibility on that particular point. So I yield my time because I interrupted you there. But
No.
just as soon as you said microaggressions, I was like, absolutely.
That's it, right?
That is something, let's layer that on. I mean, that should be your first 25% of what you're doing. It's like tackling those slights and snubs that they don't just make people feel like outsiders. They can go one step further, right? They're causing that anxiety, sometimes can cause depression in people as well, because it's just so triggering. And, I think articulating the impact of microaggressions, again, is often misunderstood as well. If you went into work and you experience one or two of these every single week, you'd probably go home and have a good night's sleep. If all you understand is a workplace where you are microaggressed 5, 6, 7, 10 times a day sometimes, your name is mistaken, people try and touch your hair, right? People question your gender, the list goes on. That's an entirely different experience. So completely hear what you're saying there in terms of just reaching out to the most marginalized and giving them a voice, because chances are their story will be, very unique and impactful.
Yeah. And I think it's critical. And I think the piece that you spoke about just now, but didn't name, is what does accountability look like on the backside of those microaggressions, right? Absolutely. And that's the piece that I think a lot of companies aren't touching in this process. We'll have workshops, and I'm not even doing workshops anymore. Right. Workshops on microaggressions or workshops on psychological safety, but then there's the now what? Okay, so now that you know and you're aware, what are you going to do to ensure that behaviors are changed? And that's the piece of this work that I think I'm calling it DEI 2.0, right? Yeah. Now it goes from awareness to action. What does this look like in the workplace? And so when you talk about psychological safety, I love doing it with an assessment, because I'm like, okay, here's baseline. This is where you are. It may not be great. I've had some clients where they've had 8s and 9s, which, okay, you're doing great. But then I also have some that have been in the 2s and 3s. And okay, there's some work that needs to happen. And so over the next 6 months, that's what we're going to do. We're going to work on ensuring that the psychological safety of your team increases for everyone, not just the majority. And so it's, how do you do that work? And then what does accountability look like in that process?
Well, you made that really important point of moving from awareness to action. And I think we couldn't talk about that shift without giving a shout out to tokenism, basically, because, let's face it, tokenism is the decay that exists within this work. And it's not just incredibly frustrating to see, it's just overall, it's just somewhat reductive. If any organization out there goes out with this intentionality to become more inclusive, more equitable to its marginalized employees, more representative of the customer and client base it should serve, or the society that it serves, tackling tokenism, again, that should be top of the list. And it's not that difficult to do. If you sidestep the virtue signaling, if you sidestep the inauthentic work, if you sidestep the conversations that don't really lead to real actions, then you start to chip away at what needs to be done. And I think, I'm not telling anyone off or shaming organizations, but it's very much the opposite, that there's a massive opportunity now to leverage the positive aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Close to 70% of millennials are looking for a D&I policy before they even apply to a position. So if you are to attract, what we would call the best talent in a level playing field right now, then visibility on the work you're doing is as important. And in order to be visible authentically, I think that's where you've got a narrative of, we're going to make sure that any of the work that we do is not rooted through tokenism, through optics, right?
I would add another piece to how to mitigate tokenism is by who are you actually giving power to? Who are you empowering in this process? Because so many organizations are putting the right face as leading some of the charge, or, we've hired this person to run our culture team, but they're not empowered to do anything. And so that's the other piece of this. It's not just putting the right faces in the right places, but allowing them to actually have power to make change happen. And I
You're
think
so right.
that's the difference that we need to start to see.
Yeah, I think that's a significant difference. And actually, you see that in the stats for the average tenure of a chief diversity officer. At most, we're pushing, the lowest being around about 18 months. And the average is, just over 2 years, sometimes closing in on 3 years. For an enterprise company that is 10,000, 50,000, potentially 100,000 employees, that's not enough of a window to create change. So what that says to us is that a lot of the time, they're not empowered from the get-go. Yes, they may be given the position. Yes, they may be given on the face of things to the outside world. It looks like they have the authority they need, but sometimes there are individuals out there that are working for huge companies that, as you say, they're not necessarily getting a seat at the table. And it also begs the question of, representation across that C-suite, and why that's also crucially important, and why we're not seeing enough action in those areas as well.
You just touched on something, and I think that that's a key piece. It's that C-suite, right? How can organizations start to make shifts there? Because what I have noticed, the easiest change has always been to put a white woman in HR in the C-suite, right?
Yeah.
Our diversity is great. Then they may or may not have, but they may have a man of color. So I'm just going to put it that way.
Yep.
In another role. But that's very rare. Yeah. And that's it, right? And they're like, oh, we have diversity at the top.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there are a few things to look at. I think the first thing to accept is we don't have a level playing field. So to go out and say to ourselves that if you work hard in any situation, of course you're going to get that position. It isn't always obvious, because of the sticky floors and glass ceilings that can exist. Underrepresented folks and marginalized folks within certain organizations aren't necessarily going to progress at exactly the same level. So that's the first thing that we need to accept. It's not that it's not possible, but we need to ensure that our processes and procedures are equitable. We then need to look at succession planning. I think a number of C-suites out there aren't necessarily going to plan for the future and then think about, well, as we plan for the future, we have a huge opportunity to ensure that we're sponsoring underrepresented folks into these positions on an annual cycle, right? Because at any given time, there are going to be any roles that could open up for various amount of reasons. So if you're robust with your succession planning and you're pulling in the importance of increasing diversity and representation, then of course, over time, it may take some time, but over time, you'll start to see changes. I think the third thing to look at is really, how important is it for us? Let me take a moment. If I'm a C-level exec, if I'm in that C-suite, let me take a moment to challenge myself. Am I building the future of work? Or am I building a representation of the past? Ultimately, what I mean by that is, even if you just take the US to start off with, right? What we would call the minority groups in the US, soon to be the majority by near and near about 2040. That's a significant shift in the makeup of the population. So I think if companies are really to take this, this mantle of, diversifying not just their just one or two token positions, but their entire organization seriously, then it's really putting this robustness behind equity and increasing representation, which is a very different outlook compared to doing what's needed or what looks best on our marketing pages, right? If we're adding robustness, we're adding rigidity, we're creating foundations for a very different and exciting future.
I love it. And you hit when you said succession planning, I was like, yes, that part.
Yeah,
because
totally.
What I noticed too is, especially in the last 2 years, a lot of organizations have done these great mentorship programs for underrepresented talent, but it's not been connected to succession planning. And my challenge to folks are, okay, people of color are over mentored, but under sponsored. So how can you create sponsorship programs, as you were saying, that's tied to succession planning, so that people that are a part of that process see a future for themselves at that organization, and they don't feel, okay, yep, I have a mentor that's going to help me get a job somewhere else, right? And I think that's what's been happening, is people are not feeling connected to or seeing themselves rise up in the ranks within their organization because they're not part of a succession plan. They don't see a future for themselves there. And so they do that self-promotion or self-promotion to the next level at some other organization. Totally. Because they don't see a promotion for themselves where they are. So when you said that, I'm like, that's a huge point that I think a lot of organizations are missing out on right now, because they are not intentional in ensuring that there's diversity and equity in that process.
I totally agree. And I think companies can keep it simple. They can just ask themselves one question, which is, do we have gatekeepers? Let's take an honest and open look at where our organization is now. Do we have leaders who are inclusive, who are out there empowering our people to be the best version of themselves, irrespective of who they are and how they choose to identify? Do we have leaders who are challenging their biases, using their privilege and power to lift others up? And if we are going to launch something like a mentorship program, to your point, is it equitable? At the end of that mentorship program, we've gone through those great learnings, we've had those courses and that content. Is there sponsorship at the end of that tunnel? And if there is sponsorship, what does that look like? So, we have to acknowledge that sometimes there are gatekeepers in the process who don't necessarily want to see change or are scared of change, and that's just anti-innovation, in my opinion. Yeah. You're decaying your company from the inside. So, from a positive note, I think a great thing you can do is really challenge your leaders on those inclusive behaviors. Because I think if that's poured into what you do, for example, if your employee 360s has a clear section in there, which points to inclusive leadership, fantastic. We get visibility and we get accountability on whether inclusive leadership behaviors are being demonstrated within our organization. And what we're not trying to do is go on a shame kind of witch hunt and seek these leaders out. But the people that we have employed, to be inspiring and to empower the people that we work with, we want them to be better. We want to give them the tools to be more inclusive. And I think asking those hard and sometimes uncomfortable questions, it takes a lot of courage. And then it obviously takes psychological safety, right? That ability to just feel confident to speak our truths when we don't see it happening.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in those 360s, historically, some of this information has come up, but the organization hasn't done anything with it, right? And so that's the piece of accountability that I think is so critical. It's okay, you know who the problem children are in the organization. Everyone knows who they are, right? What are you going to do about it? Because that and how you manage that is your company culture. It's not what you put on a website. It's not, the talking points that you give leaders when they're speaking on a stage. It's how do you deal with toxic behaviors within your organization?
Absolutely.
And that's what, especially as you spoke about the 70% of younger generations coming in are looking for diversity, equity, and inclusion as a part of the company culture. That's a piece of it. That's what they're looking for and asking about, right? And so companies can no longer hide those things. They need to be transparent in what they're doing about toxic managers. And I'm not one to say kick them all out and fire them, because they're going to go somewhere else and be toxic,
Yeah,
right?
true. True.
How can you support them in becoming more inclusive, right? How can you provide them the tools and resources that they need? Because what I'm also hearing from a lot of companies that I'm working with are middle managers aren't told how to be managers. Like, they aren't really given the tools to be successful in their jobs. And so they are getting information from the top down and the bottom up and still trying to figure out how to be inclusive in all of that. And so what can organizations do to ensure their psychological safety, but they're also getting the support, tools, resources that they need in order to make the culture one where they're not looking at employees as cogs in a wheel, but investing in the human element of things. So, yeah.
I think that's such an important point, that it's not obvious that people would just come to work and all of a sudden start to demonstrate inclusive and equitable behaviors. So providing those managers and your leaders with the right tools and understanding, knowledge and awareness, and helping them to translate that into concrete actions is how we get the work done, right? So as you say, I think there's, what you described is, two very different companies. One company where people just crack on, right? They're just generally satisfied with what they do, but they aren't necessarily trying to be inclusive or equitable. And another company, tells a very different story, one which is trying to focus on how do we empower our leaders to be the best version of themselves? How do we focus on their learning journey, their career path, and why this is such an important track for them to grow as leaders? In 10 years' time, some of the things that we're trying to advocate for now, they'll be part of institutions just in day-to-day life, right? So if you're not innovating now around this space, then it's going to be very difficult to stay with the current mode of operations. And I think now is a great time to ask questions. We've just had, and we are still going through, obviously, a really terrible global pandemic. In some of our societies in the world, we're past maybe the worst peaks, and those that have had, the privilege to be vaccinated or to stay safe. But what that has done is force people to ask questions about things like culture and values. And I think when people are joining an organization now, they are expecting to see their values reflected in company culture, what things that mean something to them. They want to join companies that actually care, right? That can speak to social justice issues, that can speak to equitable processes. And they also, I think, understand that the culture we build within organizations directly affects the fabric of our society. If we were to build corporations and institutions that continuously are inequitable and lack inclusion, well, guess what? Our society is going to look very different, because, of course, there are certain individuals who are marginalized in society who chances are won't get access to the opportunities, the career growth, the C-suite over the course of a 10 or 20 year period. So what does that society look like in 10 or 20 years? Well, we can choose that now. We can make the right decision. We can start to ask those questions and really think about the wider impact that we're making just by, taking the right steps.
Yes, all of that. It's how do we invest today into our future? Absolutely.
Totally agree.
So we're going to do a little bit of a pivot, because, I'm going to ask this question.
Yeah,
sure. What are the things that you do to take care of yourself, right? How do you fill your cup? How do you kind of come down from this work?
Yeah, so one of the things I do to really just focus on self-care is meditation. I'm a big
Mm,
reflector anyway, but I like to just take the time to, be in my thoughts and just really reflect on trauma, on being triggered, on, my life in general, my career, my family, really just to, I think, put myself in a space where, I feel calm. I feel like, I'm not taking on things that, sometimes you, as you know, you host a focus group or you host a workshop or just a discussion sometimes, and you'll just be triggered by that
mm,
discussion. And that can send you out for an hour. It can send you out for 2, 3 days. So for me, meditation isn't necessarily always in the traditional sense. It can just be sitting in a quiet space, really just kind of reflecting on, myself, where I am now and the future. But that's definitely one of the things that has kept me in a good space, in a good headspace. Another thing that I like to do is play tennis. So I like to get
mm.
out and actually play a bit of sport. Sometimes coming up to that season now where it's a bit warmer here in the UK, so can dust off the tennis racket and get onto the court. I wouldn't say I'm a Pete Sampras or anything similar, but I could definitely knock a few down the court. So I think it's the small things, hiking, just getting out there. I think I love to travel as well. Just came back from the States. Actually, I was there for a week over Easter, just seeing some family there as well. So things like this, which I think are just crucially important. You have to put them in the diary. You have to make sure that you stick to your self-care routine. Sometimes it can go off kilter, especially if you're running your own organization. You know what it's like. Your 9 to 5 doesn't end at 5 because you then got your 5 to 9 where your work basically continues. So you have to actually be pretty regimented with your self-care. I'm not always that great, but I guess that's why I've also got PT 3 times a week, so that helps with keeping me just at least healthy and in the zone. So.
I love it. Yeah, I have started doing weight training twice a week,
Nice.
but it's on the calendar. So it's like, I know
Yeah.
it's at 6:00. I have to be done on these days at least by 5:30. So those are the things that I think that are definitely helpful to kind of get your
Yeah.
mind out. And you're more worried about hitting the ball than whatever workshop you have to work for.
That's so true. That's so true. Yeah, I know when I've got my PT, my calendar, it's just 1 hour where I'm just going to be miserable. And then after that, it's just 1 hour. And then I can continue my day knowing that I'm a little bit more healthier than yesterday. So I try my best to smile. So it's tough, though. It's tough.
Yeah.
They know that. So.
I've been through PT before. Yeah. Not the best. So
Yeah.
Frank, thank you so much for joining me today. If people wanted to get in contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, they could just reach out to me on LinkedIn. So I'm just Frank Starling on LinkedIn, CEO of Variety Pack. So if you follow me on there, you can also reach out on my website, varietypack.co, and get in touch with myself or the team there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me from over the pond. We haven't talked in a while, so this has been fabulous. So thank you for that. And thank you for everyone for watching today. I hope you were able to pick up a couple of nuggets from this conversation and thinking about this work in a very different way. So you can always catch us on Tuesdays at 5:15 on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. And we will see you next time. Have a good one.